May 28, 1944, 3:47 a.m., Dover, England. The balloon was ascending through morning fog, trailing a gondola that contained no passengers, no weapons, and no apparent purpose. Ground crew watched it rise, a silvery envelope 60 feet long, filled with hydrogen, climbing at 200 feet per minute into the pre-dawn darkness. Flight Lieutenant Marcus Webb, officer in charge of the 901st Balloon Squadron, stood with his logbook, recording the launch. Height, 2,000 feet and climbing. Drift, northeast, approximately 8 knots. Payload, 400 pounds of cardboard, canvas, and carefully fabricated nonsense. Across the English Channel, 90 miles away, German radar operators at Calais were tracking the target. Slow-moving, low altitude, radar signature consistent with a small aircraft or reconnaissance balloon. Not particularly interesting. The British launched observation balloons regularly. The operators logged it and returned their attention to more threatening targets. What those German operators didn't know, what nobody, except a handful of British intelligence officers knew, was that they were watching the opening move of the most audacious deception operation of World War II. An operation so absurd, so improbable, so dependent on enemy stupidity that every rational military planner had initially rejected it as impossible. The balloon carried no bombs, no cameras, no intelligence gathering equipment. It carried lies. Meticulously crafted, expertly forged, completely fictional lies designed to convince the German High Command that the Allied invasion of Europe would occur 200 miles from where it would actually happen. The operation was called Fortitude. The balloon was Operation Titanic. And together they would fool an entire German army into defending the wrong coastline while the real invasion happened elsewhere. This is the story of how inflatable tanks, phantom armies, and one very important balloon convinced Hitler's generals that their intelligence services were brilliant when they were actually being played for fools. How British intelligence turned deception into an industrial process. How cardboard and canvas became as important as steel and explosives. And how the most ridiculous plan anyone proposed ended up being the one that worked. The mathematics of deception were already loaded in that balloon's gondola, but in September 1943, standing in a classified briefing room in London, Colonel John Bevan believed he was proposing career suicide. The concept of military deception was as old as warfare itself. Sun Tzu had written about it. Alexander had practiced it. Napoleon had perfected it. But what the Allies needed in 1943 was deception on an unprecedented scale, convincing the entire German military that an invasion involving over 1 million men would happen somewhere other than where it would actually happen. The stakes were existential. The Normandy invasion, scheduled for June 1944, would be the largest amphibious operation in history. If the Germans concentrated their forces at the actual landing sites, the invasion could fail catastrophically. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers would die on the beaches. The war could be extended by years. Germany might develop atomic weapons. The calculus was simple. Successful deception could save tens of thousands of lives. Colonel John Bevan, head of the London Controlling Section, the organization responsible for strategic deception, understood this completely. He also understood that what he was about to propose would sound insane. The Fortitude plan consisted of 2 parts. Fortitude North would suggest an Allied invasion of Norway, tying down German divisions in Scandinavia. Fortitude South would suggest the main invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel, 200 miles northeast of the actual target. The challenge was convincing the Germans. It wasn't enough to simply say there would be an invasion at Calais. The Germans had to discover it themselves through their own intelligence channels. They had to find evidence and interpret it and conclude independently that Calais was the target. Only then would they believe it. Bevan's solution was comprehensive deception warfare, creating an entirely fictional military force that the Germans would observe, track, and fear. An army that existed only in radio transmissions, falsified documents, and carefully stage-managed appearances. An army built from rubber, wood, canvas, and one strategically deployed balloon. The proposal landed on the desk of General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, in October 1943. Eisenhower read it twice, called a meeting with his intelligence chiefs, and asked the question everyone was thinking: "This is completely insane. Will it work?" The answer from his intelligence staff was carefully hedged. "Probably not, but we don't have a better option." Eisenhower approved it anyway. The alternative, a frontal assault against prepared German defenses, was too costly to contemplate. If there was any chance that rubber tanks and fake radio transmissions could draw German divisions away from Normandy, it was worth trying. Production began immediately. What followed was one of history's most elaborate theatrical productions, staged for an audience that couldn't know it was watching theater. The centerpiece was the first United States Army group, Fusog, an entirely fictional military formation supposedly consisting of 11 divisions and 150,000 men, positioned in southeastern England, preparing to invade Pas-de-Calais. Fusog existed only on paper, in radio transmissions, and in carefully crafted German intelligence reports. But the deception had to be comprehensive enough to withstand scrutiny from multiple intelligence sources. The British called in their most creative minds: set designers from film studios, stage magicians, artists, engineers, anyone who understands illusion, misdirection, and the psychology of deception. The team included Jasper Maskelyne, a stage magician who'd previously hidden the Suez Canal from German bombers using lights and mirrors; Geoffrey Barkas, a film director who'd created dummy battleships in Alexandria Harbor; and R.V. Jones, a physicist who understood how German radar worked and how to fool it. Their first challenge was creating physical evidence of a massive army where none existed. The solution was inflatable deception: rubber tanks, canvas artillery pieces, wooden aircraft, and plywood landing craft. These dummy vehicles had to be convincing enough to fool aerial reconnaissance from 20,000 feet. The inflatable Sherman tank became the workhorse of the deception program. Each unit measured 19 feet long, 9 feet wide, and could be inflated by 2 men in 15 minutes using a hand pump. When inflated, it resembled a 33-ton M4 Sherman tank. From 5,000 feet altitude, typical for German reconnaissance aircraft, it was indistinguishable from the real thing. Production was allocated to the Shepperton Film Studios, which had experience creating realistic props for war films. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same facilities that made fake tanks for entertainment were now making fake tanks for warfare. The difference was that these props had to fool trained intelligence analysts rather than movie audiences. By March 1944, British factories had produced 287 inflatable tanks, 167 inflatable artillery pieces, 432 inflatable trucks, 79 inflatable landing craft, and 143 wooden aircraft. The total cost was approximately £140,000, less than the price of 2 real Sherman tanks. Each dummy vehicle cost roughly 35 pounds to produce. Each real Sherman cost 5,000 pounds. But rubber tanks alone weren't enough. The Germans would expect to see the infrastructure supporting a real army: vehicle tracks, tent cities, supply depots, communications equipment. This required painstaking attention to detail. Special units were assigned to create convincing tracks around the dummy vehicles. Soldiers would drive real vehicles in circles near the inflatable tanks, creating tire marks visible from the air. Laundry lines were strung between fake tents. Smoke generators simulated cooking fires. Temporary roads were bulldozed, leading to nowhere. The aerial deception was supported by radio traffic that mimicked a real army group. This was the most complex part of the operation. German signals intelligence was sophisticated. They could identify individual radio operators by their fist, the distinctive pattern of how they keyed Morse code, and track units by monitoring their communications patterns. The solution was Operation Quicksilver, a comprehensive radio deception program. Real signalmen transmitted messages using call signs, frequencies, and procedures appropriate for an army group preparing for invasion. The messages were encrypted, but not so well encrypted that German codebreakers couldn't eventually decrypt them. The intelligence had to seem hard-won for the Germans to trust it. The transmissions followed realistic patterns: morning situation reports, supply requisitions, weather updates, personnel transfers, maintenance schedules. Every message reinforced the fiction that Fusog was a real formation with real problems, real logistics, and real preparations for invasion. Lieutenant Colonel Clifton James, an actor who bore a striking resemblance to General Bernard Montgomery, was recruited to impersonate Montgomery on inspection tours of Fusog installations. He would arrive by staff car, review dummy troops, and make appearances that German spies would observe and report. The Germans, tracking Montgomery's movements, would conclude that Britain's most famous general was commanding Fusog. Therefore, Fusog must be important. But Bevan understood that deception required more than stagecraft. It required understanding how the enemy thought. German intelligence operated on a system of cross-verification. They trusted information only when multiple independent sources confirmed it. The Allies needed to feed the Germans consistent information through all their intelligence channels simultaneously. This is where the double agents became critical. The 20 Committee, so named because 20 in Roman numerals is X, or double cross, controlled every German agent operating in Britain. Not some of them, all of them. Every spy Germany believed was reporting from England was actually working for British intelligence, feeding carefully crafted misinformation to their German handlers. The most important double agent was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British and Arabelle by the Germans. Garbo was a Spaniard who'd volunteered to spy for Germany, then immediately offered his services to Britain. By 1944, he ran a fictional network of 27 sub-agents, supposedly scattered across Britain, all feeding intelligence to German intelligence. Garbo's reports were masterpieces of detailed fabrication. He would report on troop movements, equipment deliveries, and military preparations, all carefully crafted to support the Fortitude deception. His information was accurate enough to build trust, but never so accurate that it compromised real operations. The Germans considered him their most reliable source. In March 1944, Garbo began sending reports about Fusog. He described the first U.S. Army group gathering in southeastern England, provided details about its component divisions, reported on supply buildups and landing craft concentrations. Every report reinforced the message: the invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais. The Germans believed him completely. Internal documents captured after the war showed that German intelligence rated Garbo's information as exceptionally valuable and forwarded his reports directly to Hitler's headquarters. The Führer himself was reading intelligence provided by a British-controlled double agent. But the most audacious element of fortitude was still to come, the element that would require balloons. Operation Titanic was conceived in December 1943 by Wing Commander Edward Fresson, an RAF officer with experience in psychological warfare. His proposal was simple but bizarre. On the night before D-Day, launch hundreds of dummy paratroopers over areas far from the real landing zones. The Germans, believing these dummies were real airborne troops, would dispatch reserves to deal with them. Reserves that wouldn't be available when the real invasion began. The execution required solving several technical problems. Real paratroopers descend at approximately 15 feet per second and reach ground in roughly 30 seconds from jump altitude. The dummies had to fall at the same rate. They had to be visible enough to be spotted, but not so obviously fake that Germans would immediately recognize them as decoys. The solution was Rupert, a canvas and rubber dummy approximately 3 feet tall, weighted to fall at realistic speeds. Each Rupert costs 3 pounds to produce. They were designed to look convincing from a distance, but wouldn't withstand close inspection. This was acceptable. The deception only needed to work for the first few hours of D-Day, while German commanders made critical deployment decisions. But Ruperts alone weren't enough. They would fall silently, landing in fields where they might not be discovered immediately. Fresson needed something that would guarantee German attention, something that would make noise, create confusion, and force the Germans to investigate. His solution was the S-phone amplifier system combined with aerial gramophone players. Devices that would broadcast recorded battle sounds, rifle fire, explosions, shouted orders from the sky as the dummies fell. The Germans would hear combat and dispatch forces to investigate, discovering the dummies only after committing troops. And to deliver this audio equipment along with the dummies, Fresson proposed using balloons. The concept was elegantly simple. Large meteorological balloons, the kind used for weather observation, would be filled with hydrogen and equipped with timed release mechanisms. Each balloon would carry a payload of Ruperts, amplifiers, and recorded sound effects. They would be launched from England and drift across the channel on prevailing winds. At predetermined times, based on altitude and estimated position, the release mechanisms would activate, dropping the dummies and sound equipment over German-occupied France. The advantage of balloons over aircraft was threefold. They were cheap, they required no pilots, and they could reach areas too dangerous for aircraft to penetrate. The disadvantage was obvious. They couldn't be precisely targeted. Wind patterns were unpredictable. Release timing was imprecise. Most balloons would miss their targets entirely. But fortitude wasn't about precision. It was about creating noise, confusion, and uncertainty. If even 20% of the balloons reached appropriate drop zones, they would achieve their purpose, making the Germans believe paratrooper drops were occurring across a wide area, forcing them to fragment their response. Production of the Titanic system began in February 1944. By May, British workshops had manufactured 500 Rupert dummies, 50 S-phone amplifier systems, 200 gramophone players loaded with combat recordings, and 150 weather balloons with timed release mechanisms. Testing occurred at night over Salisbury Plain. Observers positioned at various distances reported what they saw and heard. The results were promising. From 400 yards, the falling Ruperts looked like real paratroopers. The amplified combat sounds carried for over a mile, and the balloon delivery system worked. Approximately 30% of balloons released their payloads within 1 mile of the target zone. But the true test would come on June 5, 1944.
The planning for fortitude reached its climax in late May. Every element had to synchronize perfectly. The dummy army in southeastern England had to appear fully prepared. The radio traffic had to intensify, suggesting imminent operations. The double agents had to send final reports confirming the Calais invasion. And Operation Titanic had to deploy at precisely the right moment to maximize confusion. The German response would determine everything. If they fell for the deception, their 15th Army, stationed at Pas-de-Calais with 18 divisions, would remain in place, waiting for an invasion that would never come. If they saw through it, those divisions would rush to Normandy, potentially crushing the real invasion. On June 1st, Garbeau sent a report to his German handlers. He'd learned from his sources that Fusag was at maximum readiness. An invasion was imminent. The target appeared to be Pas-de-Calais based on the concentration of forces. German intelligence forwarded the report to the Wehrmacht High Command with the annotation, "Information from a usually reliable source appears credible." On June 3rd, RAF reconnaissance flights photographed German defensive positions at Pas-de-Calais. Analysis showed continued reinforcement. Artillery positions are multiplying. Beach obstacles are expanding. The Germans were still preparing to defend Calais. The deception was holding. On June 5th, at 2100 hours, Operation Titanic began. 50 balloons were launched from sites across southern England. Each carried 10 Rupert dummies, 1 S-phone amplifier system, and 2 gramophone players loaded with combat recordings. They ascended to 3,000 feet and drifted northeast on prevailing winds towards France. Estimated time to target zones, 90 minutes. The target zones were carefully selected, areas northeast and southwest of the actual Normandy landing sites. The northeastern drops would suggest paratrooper assaults toward Calais. The southwestern drops would suggest operations toward Brittany. Both would pull German reserves away from Normandy. At 22:47 hours, the first balloon reached its release altitude over Isigny-sur-Mer, 15 miles from the actual Normandy drop zones. The timed mechanism is activated. 10 Ruperts tumbled toward Earth. The amplifier system activated mid-descent, broadcasting recorded sounds of rifle fire and shouted commands. The gramophone players hit the ground and continued playing for 20 minutes, the duration of their spring-wound mechanisms. German listening posts near Isigny picked up the sounds immediately. Combat, definitely combat, rifle fire, explosions, English voices giving orders. Frontline commanders were alerted. A paratrooper drop was in progress. Hauptmann Klaus Schwartz, commanding a reserve company of the 352nd Infantry Division stationed near Isigny, received orders at 22:55 hours, enemy paratroopers landing in your sector, investigate and engage. He mobilized his company, 150 men who would spend the next 4 hours searching fields for enemies that didn't exist. Similar scenes played across the false drop zones. Dozens of German units scrambled to respond to the phantom paratrooper threats. Reports flooded into regional commands. Airborne assault in progress, strength unknown, multiple drop zones. Meanwhile, at 0015 hours on June 6th, the real paratrooper drops began over Normandy. American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions jumped into the dark. The British 6th Airborne Division secured the eastern flank. These were real soldiers with real objectives. But German attention was fragmented. Some units were still chasing dummies 15 miles away. The confusion multiplied through the early morning hours. German commanders receiving reports of paratrooper drops across a 60-mile front struggled to determine which reports were real. Without clear intelligence, they couldn't concentrate their forces. Reserve units were committed piecemeal, responding to threats that were often imaginary. At 0630 hours, the amphibious assault began. Allied forces stormed ashore at Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword Beaches. The scale was overwhelming: 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 156,000 troops in the first wave. This was undeniably the invasion. But where was the main effort? Was Normandy a feint before the real attack at Calais? German commanders, conditioned by months of fortitude deception, hesitated. The 15th Army remained at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for Fusag to launch the real invasion. At 0900 hours, Garbeau sent an urgent message to his German handlers. Have learned that the Normandy operation is diversionary. Main attack still to come at Pas-de-Calais. Fusag remains at readiness. The message was transmitted with appropriate urgency and imperfect encryption, making it seem like genuine intelligence hastily sent. German intelligence received the message at 11:30 hours and forwarded it immediately to OKW, Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, with priority marking. The assessment, Agent Arabelle, reports Normandy is a diversion. Main invasion expected Pas-de-Calais. Recommend 15th Army maintain current positions. Adolf Hitler, woken at 10 o'clock a.m. with news of the Normandy landings, accepted this assessment. The Fuhrer believed Normandy was a feint. He ordered the 15th Army to hold at Calais. The real invasion, the one he'd been anticipating based on months of intelligence, would come there. The 15th Army, with 18 divisions totaling over 250,000 men, remained out of the battle for the critical first 48 hours. Those divisions could have been decisive at Normandy. Instead, they defended against an invasion that existed only in the British imagination. The balloons of Operation Titanic were never intended to win the battle alone. Their purpose was narrower: create confusion during the critical first hours, fragment German response, and contribute to the larger deception that kept major reserves out of position. By this measure, they succeeded perfectly. Of the 50 balloons launched on June 5th, approximately 18 reached their designated drop zones and successfully deployed their payloads. Another 12 dropped their loads within 5 miles of targets, close enough to achieve the confusion objective. The remaining 20 either malfunctioned, drifted off course, or were shot down by German anti-aircraft fire. But 30 successful deployments were enough. German units across a 60-mile front spent hours investigating phantom paratrooper drops. Company-sized elements were committed to searches that kept them away from the real battle. Intelligence reports of widespread airborne assault suggested a massive operation, adding to German confusion about Allied intentions. The Rupert dummies themselves had varying effectiveness. Some were discovered quickly and recognized as decoys. Others remained undiscovered for hours, their mere presence creating uncertainty. A few were never found. Farmers would discover them in fields weeks or months later, weathered and torn, reminders of the elaborate deception. The most effective element was the audio recordings. The S-phone amplifiers broadcasting combat sounds from falling payloads created realistic impressions of firefights in progress. German units responded to these sounds as genuine threats, committing men and time to investigate. By the time they discovered the deception, hours had passed, hours the Allies had used to expand their beachheads. Post-war interrogations of German commanders revealed the deception's impact. General Major Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division defending the Normandy coast, reported, "In the early hours of June 6th, we received multiple reports of paratrooper landings across a wide area. Some reports proved accurate, real Allied airborne forces. Others appeared credible but led to empty fields. We couldn't distinguish between real threats and false alarms. This uncertainty delayed our response and prevented coordinated counterattacks."
Oberst Wilhelm Meyer-Dettring, intelligence officer for German Army Group B, was more blunt in his 1946 interrogation. The paratrooper deception was brilliantly executed. We expected diversionary drops, but the scale and spread of the apparent assault suggested something larger. Combined with existing intelligence suggesting Calais as the main target, it reinforced our belief that Normandy was secondary. We held back reserves that could have made a difference. But the balloon-deployed dummies were only one element of Fortitude's success. The larger deception, the Phantom Army Group, the fake radio traffic, the double-agent reports continued for weeks after D-Day, keeping German reserves pinned at Calais. Fusag remained operational through July 1944. The dummy tanks stayed inflated, the radio transmissions continued. The double agents sent updates about Fusag's preparation for the second invasion. And the Germans continued to believe it, maintaining strong forces at Pas-de-Calais while the battle raged at Normandy. It wasn't until late July, after the Allies had broken out of Normandy and begun advancing across France, that German High Command finally accepted that no second invasion was coming. By then, it was too late. The 15th Army, having waited 6 weeks for an attack that never came, was rushed to the crumbling front. But the opportunity to stop the invasion at the beaches had long passed. The final tally of Fortitude's effectiveness remains debated by historians. What's undeniable is that major German forces remained out of position during the critical initial phase of the invasion. The 15th Army's 18 divisions, if deployed to Normandy on June 6, would have vastly complicated the Allied assault. Whether they could have defeated the invasion is unknowable, but they certainly would have made it bloodier and more uncertain. Allied planners had estimated that successful deception might save 10,000 to 30,000 casualties during the invasion's first week. Actual Allied casualties in the first week were approximately 12,000 killed and wounded, within the optimistic range of predictions. Without Fortitude, estimates suggested casualties could have reached 50,000 or more. The cost-benefit analysis was remarkable. The entire Fortitude operation, dummy equipment, radio operations, double agent management, and Operation Titanic, cost approximately £2 million. This bought a deception that potentially saved tens of thousands of lives and ensured the invasion's success. Each life saved cost roughly £67 in deception expenses. Compare this to the cost of the invasion itself, £1.5 billion for equipment, transport, and logistics. The deception program cost 0.13% of the invasion budget, but arguably contributed as much to success as many far more expensive elements. The balloons specifically cost less than £5,000 to build and deploy, roughly the price of one Sherman tank. Yet they created confusion that affected German deployment of hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers during the critical hours when those forces could have been decisive. Colonel John Bevan, architect of the Fortitude Plan, never received public recognition during his lifetime. His work remained classified until the 1970s, but in his private papers, released after he died in 1978, he reflected on the operation. Fortitude succeeded not because we were clever, though we were, but because we understood our enemy. The Germans wanted to believe they had superior intelligence. They wanted to believe they'd discovered Allied plans through their own efforts. We gave them intelligence that confirmed their preconceptions. We made it hard enough to obtain that they trusted it. And we were consistent across all channels. The Germans cross-checked and found the same story everywhere. That consistency sold the deception. The balloons, the dummy tanks, the fake radio, these were props in a larger performance. But they were convincing props, and that made the performance believable. Agent Garbo, Juan Pujol Garcia, received both the Iron Cross from Germany for his valuable intelligence and the MBE from Britain for his deception work. He remains the only person to receive high military honors from both sides during the war.
After the war, he faked his death and disappeared into obscurity in Venezuela, living quietly until tracked down by a historian in the 1980s. The 20 committee's other double agents returned to normal life after the war. Most never discussed their wartime work. It remained classified for decades. Several didn't learn until the 1970s that every German agent in Britain had been controlled by British intelligence. They'd believed they were the only ones. The dummy equipment was largely destroyed or sold as scrap after the war. A few pieces survived in museums. Inflatable tanks looking absurdly fake under museum lighting, yet they'd fooled trained intelligence analysts from 20,000 feet. The Rupert dummies mostly disappeared, burned, buried, or disintegrated by weather. A handful remain in military museums, small canvas figures that once represented imaginary soldiers in a phantom army. Operation Titanic's balloons were never recovered. They drifted away after releasing their payloads, eventually coming down in the English Channel or French country. No complete balloon system survived the war. Only fragmentary records document their existence. But the impact remains documented in German records captured after the war. Intelligence assessments, troop deployment orders, situation reports, all showing German forces responding to threats that only existed in the British imagination. All showing major units held in reserve while the real battle happened elsewhere. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for OKW, testified at Nuremberg about the deception. When asked why German reserves weren't committed to Normandy, he explained, "We had intelligence indicating the main invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais. This intelligence came from multiple sources we considered reliable. The Normandy operation appeared consistent with a diversionary assault. By the time we realized our error, the opportunity to stop the invasion at the beaches had passed. We were deceived, comprehensively and expertly deceived."
The lessons of fortitude influenced military deception doctrine for decades. The comprehensive approach, combining physical deception, signals deception, and human intelligence deception, became the template for later operations. The understanding that deception must reinforce enemy preconceptions rather than contradict them. The recognition that consistency across multiple intelligence channels creates credibility. Modern military forces still study fortitude as the gold standard of strategic deception. The principles remain relevant even as technology changes. Create a coherent narrative, make the enemy discover it through their own efforts, reinforce their existing beliefs, be consistent across all channels, and understand that the goal isn't to make them believe something obviously false, it's to make them believe something plausible that leads them to make wrong decisions. The balloons of Operation Titanic represented the most whimsical element of this serious deception. Weather balloons carrying dummy paratroopers and gramophone players. It sounds like something from a comedy sketch, yet they worked. They created confusion. They influenced German deployments. They contributed to saving thousands of lives. At the Imperial War Museum in London, there's a small display on Operation Fortitude. It includes one of the surviving Rupert dummies, a canvas figure roughly 3 feet tall, weighted at the feet with a parachute harness. A placard explains it was used in deception operations during D-Day. The display doesn't mention the balloons, doesn't explain the audio recordings, doesn't detail how this absurd-looking dummy helped fool the German military. Most visitors walk past without pausing. It looks like a child's toy, not a weapon of war. That's appropriate. The best deceptions don't look impressive. They look ordinary, plausible, forgettable. Impressive deceptions draw attention. Ordinary deceptions work. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, surviving members of the deception teams gathered for a reunion in London. They were elderly now, men and women in their 70s and 80s who'd spent their youth building rubber tanks and transmitting fake radio messages. Journalists asked if they'd ever doubted the operation would work. Squadron leader Derek Thorne, who'd managed some of the balloon launches, laughed. "Of course we doubted it. We thought it was completely mad. Rubber tanks?
Fake radio transmissions? Balloons dropping dummies? It sounded like something out of a Monty Python sketch. But orders were orders, so we built the ridiculous things. And then, somehow, they worked. The Germans fell for it, completely. Looking back, I think we succeeded precisely because it was so mad. The Germans couldn't imagine we'd try something so absurd, so when their intelligence found evidence, they believed it. Who would create fake evidence that elaborate unless it was real? That logic, the deception was so elaborate it must be real, was central to Fortitude's success. The Allies invested tremendous resources in creating their phantom army. Hundreds of personnel, thousands of hours, detailed fake radio traffic, elaborate dummy installations. The sheer scale of effort convinced German analysts that it must be genuine. Why would the Allies waste resources on such an elaborate fake? The answer, which the Germans never considered, was because the real invasion's success was worth any cost, because tens of thousands of lives hung in the balance, because rubber tanks costing 35 pounds each could be as valuable as real tanks costing 5,000 pounds if they fooled the enemy into making strategic errors. General Eisenhower, in his post-war memoirs, devoted several pages to Fortitude. His assessment: the deception operations surrounding D-Day were among the most successful in military history. They bought us time, created confusion, and kept major German forces out of position during the critical phase. The invasion's success wasn't guaranteed. Many factors had to align properly, but Fortitude ensured we weren't facing the full weight of German forces on the beaches. That alone may have been decisive. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was more direct in his 1958 memoirs. Without Fortitude, the invasion would have been much bloodier, possibly unsuccessful. The Germans had sufficient forces to make Normandy untenable if they'd concentrated them properly. The deception kept them dispersed, uncertain, and slow to respond. We won the battle on the beaches, but Fortitude helped ensure we had a battle we could win, rather than a battle that would destroy us.
The academic assessment came decades later as historians gained access to classified records. The consensus? Fortitude was one of the war's most effective operations relative to its cost. It didn't win the war alone, no single operation did, but it significantly improved the odds of the invasion succeeding and did so with minimal resource expenditure. Dr. Michael Howard, official historian of British intelligence during the war, concluded in his 1990 volume, "Fortitude demonstrated that in modern warfare, deception can be as important as firepower." The operation succeeded because it was comprehensive, consistent, and exploited German preconceptions. The balloons and dummy equipment were theatrical props, but they were props in a carefully scripted performance that the Germans believed was reality. When the curtain finally came down and the Germans realized they'd been watching theater rather than intelligence gathering, the invasion was already successful and the war's outcome largely determined. The human cost saved by Fortitude remains impossible to quantify precisely. Allied casualties at Normandy were significant, approximately 12,000 in the first week, 73,000 by the end of August. But estimates for what casualties might have been without the deception range from 50,000 to 400,000 additional casualties in the first week alone. Each soldier who survived because German reserves were at Calais rather than Normandy represented a life saved by cardboard, rubber, and one well-deployed balloon. Each tank that reached the beaches without encountering additional German armor represented success bought with theatrical props. Each hour, the Allies had to consolidate their beachhead while the Germans debated whether this was the real invasion, which represented time purchased with fake radio transmissions. The crazy plan worked, not despite being crazy, but because it was crazy enough to be believable. Because the Germans couldn't imagine the Allies would invest such effort in pure fabrication. Because a weather balloon carrying dummy paratroopers was absurd enough that nobody would invent it unless it was real.
In the end, the most ridiculous idea anyone had, inflatable tanks, phantom armies, balloons dropping canvas soldiers, fooled an entire military establishment. The deception didn't just work, it worked brilliantly. And it worked precisely because everyone initially thought it was too absurd to possibly succeed. The balloon rose into the pre-dawn sky on June 5, 1944, carrying its cargo of carefully crafted lies. Hours later, those lies had become German intelligence assessments. Days later, those assessments had become German strategic decisions. Weeks later, those decisions had become German defeat. The theater of war had produced its most successful performance. The audience never knew they were watching fiction until the final curtain fell and reality came ashore at Normandy. One balloon, 400 pounds of canvas and cardboard, and the fate of tens of thousands of soldiers changed by theatrical props launched into the night sky. The Germans had laughed when they first learned of Operation Titanic in captured documents after the war. Dummy paratroopers? Audio recordings of fake battle sounds delivered by balloons? It was absurd. It was ridiculous. It was the sort of desperate gambit that should never work. By the time they finished laughing, they understood. It had worked. Completely. They'd been played for fools by cardboard soldiers and rubber tanks. Their intelligence services, which they'd believed were penetrating Allied security, had been feeding them fiction for months. Their careful analysis had been analyzing carefully constructed lies. The laughter died, just like it always did. At Point du Hoc, overlooking Omaha Beach, there's a memorial to the Rangers who scaled the cliffs on D-Day. Nearby is a small information placard about deception operations. It mentions fortitude briefly, notes that dummy equipment and false intelligence kept German reserves away from Normandy. Doesn't mention the balloons, doesn't explain the full scope of the theater that was performed. Most visitors don't read the placard. They're focused on the cliffs, the bunkers, the real battlefield where real soldiers fought and died. That's appropriate. The deception was important, but the courage was decisive. But without the deception, more courage would have been required, more blood would have been spilled, more names would be carved into memorial stones. The balloons didn't fire shots or storm beaches, but they may have saved as many lives as units that did. The crazy war plan that actually worked thanks to a balloon remains history's least known critical operations. It lacks the drama of battlefield combat. The heroism isn't obvious. A balloon carrying dummy soldiers isn't as memorable as soldiers storming a beach under fire. But measured by its contribution to victory and its cost in resources, fortitude and its ridiculous balloon-deployed component ranks among the war's most effective operations. It was crazy, it was absurd, it was impossible. And it worked. The sky over Dover on May 28, 1944, held a silver balloon ascending through morning fog. Inside its gondola lay lies that would become intelligence, intelligence that would become decisions, decisions that would change the war. Nobody watching it rise could have known its importance. It looked like a weather balloon, harmless, forgettable, ordinary. The best weapons often do. The sky over Dover on May 28, 1944, held a silver balloon ascending through morning fog. Inside its gondola, lies that would become intelligence, intelligence that would become decisions, decisions that would change the war. Nobody watching it rise could have known its importance. It looked like a weather balloon, harmless, forgettable, ordinary. The best weapons often do. The final statistics of Operation Fortitude and its balloon-deployed component tell a story that transcends individual battles. The entire deception program, from conception to execution, employed approximately 1,100 personnel. The physical deception elements cost £2 million total. The operation diverted or delayed 19 German divisions during the critical first week of the invasion. Each division contained approximately 12,000 to 15,000 men. The mathematics are inescapable. Over 250,000 German soldiers remained out of position because of rubber tanks, fake radio transmissions, and balloons carrying canvas dummies. If even half those forces had been properly positioned at Normandy on June 6th, Allied casualties could have doubled or tripled. The beachheads might have failed. The invasion might have been thrown back into the sea. Instead, the Germans defended vigorously at the wrong place while defending inadequately at the right place. Their armor remained at Calais. Their reserves stayed uncommitted. Their response was fragmented, hesitant, and ultimately ineffective. All because they believed their intelligence services were brilliant when those services were actually reading from a script written in London. The post-war analysis by Allied operational research teams concluded that fortitude contributed to shortening the war in Europe by an estimated 6 to 12 months. Every month the war continued cost tens of thousands of military and civilian lives. If fortitude shortened the war by even 6 months, it saved hundreds of thousands of lives across Europe, Allied soldiers, German soldiers, and civilians caught in the combat zone. The cost-benefit ratio defied conventional military economics. £2 million bought a deception that may have saved 200,000 lives and shortened the war by months. No weapon system, no tactical innovation, no strategic campaign achieved comparable results for comparable cost. And at the heart of it, among the rubber tanks and fake radio transmissions, were balloons carrying dummies, creating confusion in the dark, buying hours that became days, that became victory. The irony was perfect. The most technologically advanced war in history, featuring radar, rockets, and atomic weapons, was influenced decisively by weather balloons and canvas dolls. The sophisticated intelligence networks of the German military were defeated by theater students and stage magicians. The careful analysis of trained intelligence officers was rendered worthless by carefully crafted fiction. In December 1945, after Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence officers toured captured German headquarters and examined their intelligence files. The Fortitude files were extensive, hundreds of reports, assessments, and analyses. German intelligence had tracked Fusag's movements, documented its preparations, and predicted its attack with impressive thoroughness. Every word was fiction, but the Germans had never doubted it. Why would they? Multiple independent sources confirmed the same information. The intelligence was hard-won: decoded radio transmissions, aerial reconnaissance photos, agent reports. It all correlated perfectly. It was exactly what trained analysts expected to see. That expectation was their weakness. They expected to see certain patterns, so when British deception specialists created those patterns, the Germans saw confirmation rather than fabrication. They were looking for the truth so earnestly that they found it even where it didn't exist. Squadron Leader Thorne, the balloon operations officer, visited one of these captured headquarters in 1946. He saw the intelligence files on Operation Titanic. German analysts had documented the paratrooper drops, estimated force strength, and assessed tactical implications. The reports were detailed, professional, and completely wrong. Thorne later wrote in his personal diary, "Reading their analysis of our balloon-dropped dummies was surreal. They'd taken our absurd theatrical props and analyzed them as serious military operations. They'd estimated the number of paratroopers based on the dummies found. They'd assessed the attack objectives based on where the dummies landed. They'd concluded the drops were part of a larger airborne assault, all from canvas dolls and recorded sound effects. We'd created theater, and they'd written serious military analysis of it. If it wasn't so tragic, all those German soldiers chasing shadows while real battles happened elsewhere, it would be funny." But it wasn't funny. It was war. And in war, deception that works saves lives. The German soldiers who spent June 6th searching fields for phantom paratroopers weren't at Normandy shooting Allied troops. The tank divisions waiting at Calais for an invasion that never came weren't crushing the beachheads. The reserves held back because Hitler believed Normandy was a diversion weren't turning the tide when it could have been turned.
Every German soldier who died at Normandy was a tragedy, but fewer died there than would have if German forces had been properly concentrated. Every Allied soldier who died storming the beaches paid the ultimate price, but fewer paid it because German resistance was divided, confused, and inadequate. The balloons didn't win the war. The soldiers did. But the balloons helped ensure the soldiers had a war they could win. Colonel Bevan, the architect of fortitude, never discussed his work publicly. He returned to civilian life, worked in business, and died in 1978, with his wartime achievements still classified. His obituary mentioned government service during the war, but provided no details. Only years later, when documents were declassified, did the full scope of his contribution become clear. In his private papers, donated to the Imperial War Museum after his death, Bevan reflected on the balloon operation specifically. Titanic was the most absurd element of fortitude. Weather balloons dropping dummies and gramophone players. It sounded like something from a comedy. But absurdity was the point. We needed multiple small diversions to create overall confusion. We needed German forces to fragment their response rather than concentrating on the real threat. The balloons achieved this perfectly. They cost almost nothing, risked no pilots, required minimal resources, yet they created confusion across a wide area during the critical hours. Judged purely by results versus investment, they may have been the most efficient weapon we deployed on D-Day. That assessment, most efficient weapon deployed on D-Day, would surprise most people. The efficient weapons were supposed to be the ships, the aircraft, the tanks, the artillery, not balloons carrying canvas dolls. But efficiency in warfare isn't measured by sophistication. It's measured by achieving objectives relative to cost. A rifle that stops an enemy soldier is efficient. 1,000,000 rifles that rust in a warehouse are a waste. A complex weapon system that fails is expensive scrap. A simple balloon that achieves its purpose is brilliant economy. Operation Titanic balloons achieved their purpose. They cost £5,000 total, less than one Sherman tank. They created confusion that influenced the German deployment of hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers. The return on investment was extraordinary. Modern military forces still study this operation, though often skeptically. In an era of precision-guided munitions and satellite surveillance, weather balloons carrying dummies seem quaint, irrelevant, a historical curiosity with no contemporary application. Yet the principles remain valid. Deception works when it reinforces enemy preconceptions. Small, cheap operations can have a strategic impact if properly timed and positioned. The enemy's intelligence services are most vulnerable when they're confident they're seeing clearly. These principles transcend technology. They're about understanding human psychology, organizational behavior, and decision-making under uncertainty. A modern military facing a sophisticated adversary can still use deception to create uncertainty, fragment response, and buy time. The tools change. Now it's cyber operations and electronic warfare rather than balloons and dummies. But the logic remains constant. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, British Army created a temporary exhibition about Operation Fortitude. Among the displays was a reconstructed Rupert dummy with its parachute, an inflatable Sherman tank, and a recording of the fake battle sounds used in 1944. Veterans who'd participated in the deception attended. Most were in their 80s now.
the few still alive, from an operation that had employed over 1,000 people. They watched visitors examine the exhibits, saw people laugh at the obvious fakery of the inflatable tank, heard people ask, how can anyone fall for such obvious props? Wing Commander James Sanderson, who'd helped manage the balloon launches and was 84 at the exhibition, overheard one visitor say, "These look so fake. How did the Germans believe them?" Sanderson approached the visitor and explained patiently. From 20,000 feet, in a reconnaissance photograph, that inflatable tank looked exactly like a real one. The German photo analysts weren't stupid. They were skilled professionals analyzing images under time pressure. They saw what they expected to see because we made sure every detail supported that expectation. The tanks were positioned in realistic formations. Tracks led to and from them. Support vehicles were nearby. Nothing looked out of place when viewed from altitude. He paused, then added, "The dummy tank under museum lights looks fake because you can examine it closely and because you know it's fake." German analysts examining grainy photos from miles away didn't have that luxury. They were looking for intelligence, not checking for fraud. That's why it worked. The visitor nodded slowly, understanding dawning. Deception works not by creating perfect replicas, but by creating sufficient plausibility for distant observation under pressure. The Germans weren't fools. They were competent, careful, and thorough. They'd been beaten by deception that was more competent, more careful, and more thorough. That was something to be proud of, not because it humiliated the enemy, but because it demonstrated excellence in a difficult art. Squadron Leader Thorne, present at the same exhibition at age 86, was asked by a journalist, "Looking back, what do you think when you see these exhibits?" Thorne considered the question carefully before answering. "I think about the soldiers who landed at Normandy. Every hour we bought them, every German unit chasing phantoms instead of defending beaches, meant more of our boys made it off the landing craft alive. We didn't storm beaches. We didn't fight with rifles. We launched balloons and inflated rubber tanks and sent fake radio messages. It felt silly at the time, playing dress-up basically, but it saved lives. Real lives, men who came home to their families instead of being buried in France. When I see these exhibits, I think about them. And I think that launching balloons at midnight in Dover was the most important thing I did in my entire life, even though it felt ridiculous at the time. That perspective, that the absurd operation was the most important work of a lifetime, captured something essential about fortitude. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic in conventional terms. It was technical, meticulous, and often boring. Filling balloons with hydrogen, checking release mechanisms, recording weather data, inflating tanks, transmitting meaningless radio messages according to precise schedules. None of it seemed significant in the moment. All of it was critical to the outcome. The last surviving member of the Fortitude Deception Team, Lieutenant Margaret Wilson, who'd worked on the dummy equipment production, died in 2019 at age 98. In her final interview conducted 6 months before her death, she was asked what she wanted people to remember about the operation. Her answer was characteristically precise. "Remember that winning wars isn't always about who has the biggest guns or bravest soldiers. Sometimes it's about who makes fewer mistakes. The Germans made the mistake of believing their intelligence was better than it was. We made them believe that by feeding them what they expected to see. The balloons, the tanks, all the props, they were just tools. The real weapon was understanding how the Germans thought and using that understanding against them. That's the lesson. Understand your enemy better than they understand themselves, and you can defeat them with balloons and cardboard." She died 3 weeks after that interview. The obituaries mentioned her wartime service but provided few details. Even 75 years later, some aspects of fortitude remained sensitive. But her message survived. The crazy war plan worked, not because it was crazy, but because it was crazy in exactly the right way. Crazy enough to be dismissible if discovered. Crazy enough that no rational enemy would suspect it. Crazy enough to hide a sophisticated strategy behind apparent absurdity. The balloon that rose over Dover on May 28, 1944, represented that philosophy perfectly. A weather balloon, ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable, carrying a payload that would help change history, creating an outcome that nobody watching it ascend could have predicted. 75 years later, military historians debate fortitude's exact impact. Was it decisive? Merely helpful? Essential? The consensus remains, impossible to know definitively, but almost certainly significant. The Germans were beaten by many factors: Allied material superiority, strategic errors, fighting on multiple fronts, and atrocities that motivated resistance. Fortitude was one factor among many, but it was a factor that cost almost nothing and may have saved tens of thousands of lives. That alone justifies its place in history. The crazy war plan worked. The balloon carried its lies into the sky. The Germans believed them. And on June 6, 1944, Allied soldiers stormed beaches defended by forces weaker than they should have been because other forces were 200 miles away, waiting for an invasion that existed only in imagination. The mathematics of deception had proven sound. The theater had convinced its audience. The props had played their role perfectly. And when the final curtain fell, the stage was littered with rubber tanks, canvas dummies, and the wreckage of German assumptions. The audience finally understood they'd been watching fiction. By then, reality had already won. One balloon, one crazy plan, one perfect deception. The Germans had laughed when they learned the truth. The Allies had used balloons and dummies to fool them. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was humiliating. The laughter died when they counted the cost, when they realized how completely they'd been played, when they understood that their careful intelligence analysis had been analyzing the British theater. At the German Military Archive in Freiburg, there's a file cabinet containing the Fortitude intelligence reports. Hundreds of documents, thousands of pages, all carefully analyzed, all professionally assessed, all completely wrong. A note attached to the file, added by German archivists in 1946, reads simply, Intelligence Assessments 1943 to 1944. Operation Fortitude, Allied Deception Operation. All information in these files was fabricated by British intelligence. German forces acted on these assessments, resulting in strategic deployment errors during the Normandy invasion, retained for historical study of intelligence failure. That note, retained for historical study of intelligence failure, might be the Germans' greatest gift to future military professionals. The acknowledgement that they were beaten comprehensively and expertly by an enemy who understood deception better than they understood detection. The balloon rose, the dummy fell, the Germans responded, and history changed. All because someone had a crazy idea involving a balloon, and someone else was desperate enough to try it. The most ridiculous plan anyone proposed became the plan that worked, not despite being ridiculous, but because ridiculous was exactly what the moment required. The thunder had spoken, not with guns, but with silence. The silence of armies that weren't there. The silence of invasions that never came. The silence of a phantom army group that existed only in German fear and British imagination. And in that silence, real soldiers landed on real beaches and began the liberation of Europe. helped by a balloon that carried lies into the morning sky. The crazy plan worked. History records it as a success, but it remains crazy, wonderfully, perfectly, necessarily crazy. Just crazy enough to save thousands of lives and change the world.